Chapter 11. A Good Bit of Work. Dawn spread along the skyline. In his room in the men's quarters, Yabba saw the window lighten. A grayish raw tinge smudged the panes. Bending over, he swung his swag lightly across his shoulders. With a dilly bag in one hand and a billy in the other, he tiptoed from the room. Outside on the path to the gateway, his boots patted quietly on the dust. Passing the boys' bunkhouse, he listened before going on to the gate. As it clinked behind him, he looked around in surprise. The boy, followed by a barely discernible Rags, was coming toward him. The two looked immeasurably small against the great gray morning quietness. For a moment words filled in Yabba's throat. Then he said, "Well, I'm blessed. So you made it, son. I thought you'd still be in bed." The boy was close when he shrugged. I don't know. I'm usually about early. I thought I'd be about to see ya." As he spoke, he glanced at Yabba's swag, and down to the dilly bag and Billy. They all looked to be part of the swag man himself. Yabba hitched the swag before he turned to walk beside the boy. Almost elbow-touching, they walked toward the peppercorns. Rags trotted behind, content to be following. Under the big old trees, the boy glanced up when he asked, "Are you glad to be leaving, or have you, got a bit of worry about a job or things like that?" Accidentally, he bumped Yabba's arm. The muscles felt ridged and tough. Walking slowly, Yabba stared straight ahead. The track stretched on and on to the scrublands. Beyond again stretched never-ending plains. "No," he finally said. "It's like I told you. You can never stop once you start. There ain't no end to it, boy, and you have to go on." In the grayish light, his eyes picked out familiar landmarks. He wondered if ever he would see Yambura again. The boy rubbed his hands for somewhere to put them. He rammed them down into his pockets. "Yeah," he said with a nod. "I reckon you do. A feller can't change what his life's going to be." At square Yambura mailbox, they both stopped. Yabba shifted the billy from his hand. He tried to look directly at the boy, but had to turn away. "He's a good kid," he thought, "and sorta gets you. There's a loneliness about him that ain't right." Suddenly he held out his free hand. "Well, there it is, son, and I have to be travelin'. Maybe I'll see you sometime when I'm passin' by this way." He felt the boy's hand grip his own, then drop away. "Yeah," the boy said. "Yeah, Yabba, I hope you will. It's been good meetin' you." Yabba regripped the billy and began to walk. His feet strode with a slow, steady rhythm. The billy swung in his hand. "Yeah," he called over his shoulder. "It has at that. So long, son, and look after that dog. He's your'n, and don't let him go." Gradually he lengthened his stride. His whole body swayed with a slow, rockin' motion. Under the pulled-down hat brim, his eyes were fixed on the skyline. The boy stared after him. In the brightening light, he could see the swing of Yabba's shoulders. Though the swag hung across them, they looked free. "So long, Yabba," the boy called. "So long, mate, and thanks. I'll try and do what you say." When Yabba waved the billy, the boy half waved in reply, then turned and walked toward the homestead. Rags trotted behind, near his heels. At the peppercorns, the boy looked back. Yabba was already growing smaller on the twin-ribboned ruts of the track. Beyond him spread a wide sweep of scarlet sky in the hazed red light. Yabba seemed dwarfed by the land's empty vastness. "It's big," the boy thought, "though it's only sometimes it strikes you. You have to see it the way it is now." Just old Yabba, alone against the sunrise. When they reached the wood heap, he pulled Rags to him. Together they squatted down, the boy with his back to a log and Rags on his haunches in between the boy's legs. The boy sat for a while watching Yabba grow smaller and smaller. Finally he disappeared. "You know," the boy said, as he smoothed Rag's ears. "There's a lot in what Yabba said, but the trouble is he don't know Kanga. He only met him once, on the night he was in. What I've seen of it, Rags, you can't change people, I don't suppose." "I'll change old Kanga." Rags cocked his head, then burrowed between the boy's hands. Together they listened to the cocks beginning to crow, and a scatter of hens clucking under the hedge. Presently the long-tailed goanna scuttled into view. Head poised in weariness, it began to scamper toward the wood heap. Gripping Rags, the boy waited until it was close, then dived headlong to grab its tail. He missed by inches and almost fell, but pushed himself upright. Rags, too, skidded around on all four paws as the weary lizard swerved. For a second, boy, dog, and goanna all stared at each other. The goanna moved first. With a flick of its head and tail, it scuttled between the boy's legs. Surprised, he jumped at the same time as Rags leaped. The two collided in midair while the goanna scuttled on. Helter-skelter, boy and dog raced after the flying lizard. Over sticks under the wheelbarrow and around the wood heap it scampered, with its head poked out, looking for shelter. Every time it swerved, the boy or Rags stopped it from escaping. Suddenly the willy goanna flopped flat on its big, swollen belly. The boy and Rags skidded, but too late. The goanna waddled happily behind them into the piled high wood heap. They saw its tail switch, wriggling under a log. Slumping down the wheelbarrow, the boy wiped his face. "Phew," he gasped. "We nearly had him. And did you see his belly? He's as full of eggs as a frog. No wonder he's fat and shiny." Rags cocked his head, ready for more excitement, and stared longingly at the boy. In the peppercorns, the first galahs squawked at the coming sun. Still puffing heavily, the boy stood up. "Which reminds me," he told Rags, "about them chicks. We better start now and shift 'em round." With Rags dancing behind, he headed for the killing pens. A bucket always hung there for general use. As he lifted it down, the boy suddenly remembered. "Gory," he thought, "that seems a long time ago. This is the bucket old Kanga put the pups in, the one I carried out to the sandhills." Instinctively he bent to stroke Rags' head. "You're lucky," he said. "Your luck was really in. And you know, it makes you think. They could all be running around like you. 7 of you instead of 1. The thought made him wonder he was still thinking about it when he crawled under the hedge. Gentle with the chicks, he gathered them into the bucket. The little things cheeped when their excited mother tried to scramble in after them, but the boy clutched her legs. He tucked her under his arm as he crawled out backwards. Rags kept by his side, keen-eyed at the whole performance. Walking past the kitchen, he heard Miss Jones open the door. "My goodness," she said, "what have you got?" "Oh, I see, a new batch of chicks, and they do look bonny," she added, peering into the bucket. "Will you take them down for me?" The boy looked around happily. He liked the excitement of things young and newborn. "Sure," he said, "I'd take 'em anywhere. Ain't they beauts, Miss Jones? They are as yellow as little puffballs." Bucket in one hand, hen clutched with the other, he continued on across the garden. A row of small wired pens stood shaded by a weeping willow. Half-grown chicks chirruped and chattered in most of them. Miss Jones smiled after him. She could see him threading between the vegetable beds. "Don't be long," she called. "Your breakfast is ready, and mind about Rags." "Ross is somewhere near the men's mess room." Chuckling, she went back into the kitchen. The door closed softly behind her. At the pens, the boy pushed the hen in first, then snuggled the chicks under her. As a guide for Rags, he set the bucket at the back of the pens. "Stay here," he told him. till I've finished eating. When the coast is clear, we'll nip outside. That way old Ross will never see." Whistling contentedly, he threaded again to the kitchen. As he pulled open the door, he glanced for a final check. Both Rags and the bucket were hidden. Even hawk-eyed Charlie could not have seen them. After breakfast, the boy took Rags out through a little side gate. Walking around past the trough with the bucket in his hand, he met Ross. The overseer stopped to say, "Hi, son. I hear you've been busy." His eyes squinted downwards as he said it. Screwing tobacco on his palm, he rolled and lit a cigarette. The boy scuffed a boot. I helped a bit," he said, "but not all that much." Rags seemed uncertain of Ross, and the hackle half rose off his sleek young neck. Ross drew in a lungful of smoke before he said, "You needn't worry. I know the whole story. That was a good bit of work you did, fixing the chimney." He stared beyond the boy to the horse yards. Horses were being driven in. Charlie and another stockman galloped behind them in the dust. Bending down, the boy smoothed Rags' neck. When he straightened again, he rubbed his hand on his trousers. "Yeah," he told Ross, "it wasn't bad. Though Miss Jones helped, I couldn't have done it without her." Ross nodded. "Sure," he said, "I guess she did, but we ain't here to argue. The boss gets back Thursday, son, with powder and patches. You can take Wednesday off, have a day off to do nothing." Bow-legged on his turned over heels, he rocked toward the horse yards. A thin smear of smoke trailed after him. Surprised, the boy shifted the bucket. His voice almost cracked as he called, Thanks. Thanks a lot for the day." Without turning around, Ross waved. "Okay, just see that you use it." Ahead of him, Charlie slammed the gates. A thick cloud of dust swirled over the horse yards. Continuing on, the boy headed for the killing pens. On the cool, smooth concrete, he upended the bucket and sat on it. Rags sprawled full length near the tap. "I don't know," the boy said, "what we'll do with the day. You get used to doing odd jobs." The boy shaded his eyes, black-winged against the glare. A flight of crows flew toward him from the east. He counted 7 of them, flying in ragged formation. As they plummeted clumsily down near the pens, their sleek black feathers shone. Beady-eyed and obese, they croaked while they peered in through the rails. Watching them, the boy guessed their purpose. He stood up slowly and hooked the bucket on its peg. "They've got an instinct," he thought, "that'd make you sick. They can sense when something's going to die as sure as anything. Joe'll kill tonight, and that's why they're waiting. I expect Ross and them are going out now to get a bullock." With these thoughts in his mind, he said, "Come on, Rags. We'll get away from the stinkers. I can't stand the sight of 'em." At the wood heap, he hefted his axe as Ross rode by. Side by side with Charlie on a bay and Joe on a taffy, the overseer straddled a big brown horse. In the drifting dust behind, 5 other stockmen rode stirrup to stirrup. Once past the peppercorns, the 5 cantered away in a southerly direction. Ross, Charlie, and Joe eased their horses into a trot along the track Yabba had traveled. Leaning on the axe, the boy watched the 2 parties split. "You see," he told Rags, "what I reckon is right. There's Ross and the other 2 gone for a bullock, and the others to some other job." Spitting on his hands, he began to split wood. Rags watched the axe rise and fall before he crept in under a log. After a time, the boy straightened. "That's enough now," he said, and wedged the axe in a log. "We'll cart a bit over, then see what's doing. I feel a bit restless, with Yabba leaving, and everybody else sort of galloping about." With Rags watching every movement, he loaded the wheelbarrow in a trundling, familiar pattern They wheeled toward the kitchen, wheelbarrow in the lead, the boy in the middle, Rags trailing behind, almost dragging his head in the dust. The sun flared down from a yellowing sky. As they reached the gate, Ted bustled out, carrying a handful of tools. "Hi, son," he said. "If you've got the time, I could do with some help. I'm cutting chaff in the hay shed." He wiped his chin as he said it. Sweat was already trickling on his brown lime face. The boy brightened. "Sure," he said with a grin. "We'll be there in a minute. Just give me time to unload this stuff." He nodded at the wood. Ted waved the tools. "Don't hurry," he said. "I've got a bit to do first. Come on over when you're ready." Wiping his face again, he walked on towards the stables. The boy wheeled his barrow through the gateway. Later in the shed with Ted, he climbed up to the top of the hay pile. Rags scrambled up at his heels, slipping and sliding on the slippery, crackling sheaves. On the top, the boy began to toss down sheaves. "They're on their way, Ted," he called down in warning. "I'll level 'em off as I go." Suiting the words to his actions, he pelted down sheaf after sheaf. Scuffling a sleeve across his face, Ted tightened the blade set screws. A hurtling sheaf made him chuckle as he dodged. All right," he shouted. "That's fine. Only don't make it too willing. I'm up to me neck in it now. And another thing," he added, "look out for snakes. Sometimes it's crawling with 'em." Bent over again, he started to oil the whole machine. After Ted's advice, the boy worked more slowly. "It ain't a matter," he told Rags, "of being scared. It's common sense. We've had enough trouble with crawlers one way and another." Legs buried in hay, Rags floundered and capered. The shed felt cool to them both, in place of the fierce heat outside. When Ted shouted, "Ready, you can come on down," the boy and Rags slid straight off the top to the piled hay below. Floundering upright, the boy ordered Rags to one side. "Get over there," he told him, "and watch what we're doing. That way you won't get caught in the machine." As he spoke, he pointed to a corner. Rags crept there immediately, without even pausing. Watching the young dog, Ted nodded approvingly. "He's a good 'un," he said. "You made a good job of him, son. And old Kanga ought to be pleased. He's got a well-trained dog to start in on." Turning away to start a chaff cutter, he failed to see the boy's face. It changed swiftly from fun to wistful longing. Lines puckered the broad, splattered freckles. For a moment the boy stood unmoving. Then he bent to begin cutting strings on the hay sheaves. As he gathered the strings in his hand, he said, "Yeah, I suppose he will. But you know how it is. I don't like to think about it." His words were drowned in the sudden clatter of the started machine. Ted merely nodded, pretending to have heard. With his hand on the gear lever, he beckoned for hay. "Okay," he shouted, "keep it coming behind me, and make sure the strings are cut." The clatter increased when he pulled down the lever, and the blades began to spin. Working quickly, the boy pushed sheaf after sheaf into the feed chute. Ted forced them on, into the keen, spinning blades. Soon a pile of shiny, rippling chaff began to spread on the hay room floor. They worked in silence. The fast, rattling machine left no time for thinking. For the boy it was a case of bend, lift, and push, bend, lift, and push. For Ted it was push and avoid slicing his fingers off in the sharp, whirling blades. When they passed, it was to toss fresh hay down from the stack. Finally Ted slammed the gear lever shut, then stopped the machine. Leaning against the chute, he stared in satisfaction at the great mound of chaff. The boy wiped sweat and chaff dust on his shirt sleeve. "That's right," Ted said. "Now we'll have a drink of tea. There's a drop of cold in me billy." Followed by the boy and Rags, he picked up the billy and carried it outside. Close to the wall, he hunkered down under the overhanging eaves. "Here'll do," he added. "We can have a breath of air. That dusty hay choke you once you start to toss it about. He tipped tea into the billy lid, then passed it to the boy. For himself he poured into a stained, battered mug. The boy let the tea flow over his dry tongue, down his parched throat. He sighed when the billy lid was empty. As he wiped his mouth, he mumbled, "Core, that was good. You could feel it soaking in. I can still feel trickle running down me neck." He shook the last drops from the lid, and Rags licked the dust where the drops had splashed. Ted refilled the lid and passed it back again. "We'll give 'em a drop," he said, "to make it all square. He can have it out of me hat." Pulling the dusty felt from his head, he bashed in the crown, then filled the hollow. Tea slopped over the brim as he pushed it along the ground. "There," he added, "you can give it him yourself. He's used to your hand for feeding." The boy said, "Yeah, he isn't that. I'm the only one that's ever fed him. He wouldn't take a lick from a stranger." Then he passed the hat to Rags. Ted nodded. "That's the way I reckoned. He's a good 'un all right. I'll take 'm a while to get used to old Kanga." This time he saw the boy's face. "That's of course," he went on quickly, "if Kanga takes him. I wouldn't reckon he would." He emptied the billy into his mug, then drained it and scrambled upright. "I've said the wrong thing," he thought, "and ought to have known better. The best thing to do is brush it over." Yabba knew the right way to talk to him. Inside the shed, Ted gathered his tools. The boy stood by the door holding the billy. "Yes," Ted said, looking round, "there's a fair bit of chaff here. If you want some over in your bin, I'll help you carry it." He walked outside again while he was speaking, and the boy followed him. Together they moved toward the little feed shed. Rags padded behind in the dust stirred by their feet. They were almost at the shed before the boy answered. He had been thinking about what would happen. Would the old man come for Rags as suddenly as he had for Bolga? Thought of her made the boy's throat fill. "It's right, Ted," he managed to say. "Though thanks, just the same. I'll do it myself, with the wheelbarrow." Ted nodded. "Okay, if you can manage it." Then he walked away. The boy had to run after him to give him the billy. Afterwards, and for the next few days, the boy thought often about Kanga, and to his worried eyes, Rags seemed to be growing too quickly. "I ought to starve you," he said at one time, when they were sitting on the wood heap, "but I can't." And you know, he added, "it's all right for Ted and Yabba to talk, yet there ain't a man that'd stand up to old Kanga. What chance is there then for a feller like me?" As he said it, Rags looked around and nuzzled the boy's hands. Neither of them noticed when a snake slithered by, then coiled down under a log. Chapter 12. Kangaroo. The boy yawned, rolling over onto his back. He stared up at the ceiling. He could just see the rafters shadowed in half-light. "I'll get across," he thought, "and see how Rags is, then afterwards drop in for early breakfast." Miss Jones said it'd be ready. Groping for his boots, he found them under the bunk and pulled them on. After the usual quiet stomp to make them fit, he went outside to the garden's warm quietness. The air felt fresh after the hot, stuffy room. On his way to the shed, he angled first along the hedge to the water trough. In the cool, hissing water under the ballcock, he sluiced his face and hands, then dunked his head. "Phew," he spluttered, flicking water off with his hands. "It's cold at first, but soon wakes you up." Continuing on to the shed, he unbarred the sagging door. Inside, Rags peered from a heap of straw. His tail whisked, feathering behind him when he jumped. "Hi, feller," the boy laughed and caught Rags in midair. "You seem real glad to see me, but you want to look out. I'm still dripping wet." He shook his head as he spoke and splattered Rags with water. "I'm one eager bound." The young dog leaped through the doorway. In one eager bound, the young dog leaped through the doorway, then galloped around in circles. The boy leaned on the door jamb to watch. To the east, a vast stained sky grew vividly lighter. The purples and mauves changed to crimson and gold. I don't know, the boy thought. There's something there you can't quite describe. Yet a dog don't see it, though you think he might. He only looks when he knows you're looking. Bemused with his philosophizing, he wandered on toward the kitchen. Rags padded behind at a steady walk. Nearing the gate, they noticed familiar movements, the whisper and rustle of dawn, hens scratching under the hedge, and big-combed roosters crowing to the coming day. Up in the peppercorns, galahs fluttered their wings in the leaves. Everything's moving, the boy thought, but I don't see the old goanna. We must have scared 'em silly. Leaving Rags outside, he pushed open the gate and went through. In the kitchen, Miss Jones stoked the fire. "You've wasted no time," she said, glancing round. "I've just put some steak on." The boy nodded. "Yeah, and it smells good, Miss Jones," and added, sitting down, "But you don't want to hurry. I can cut some bread if you like." He looked around as he spoke and saw a package. The sandwiches were already cut. Miss Jones had had her back turned but guessed where the boy was looking. "Don't worry," she said. "They're already cut, and there's an extra one for Rags." Busy with the steak, she tut-tutted when the kettle boiled. The boy grabbed the teapot quickly. "I'll make some tea," he said. "At least that'll be something. How many spoons will I tip in?" Miss Jones chuckled when she said, "3, but warm the pot first." Afterwards, sitting at the table with the steak in front of him, the boy said, "I've been thinking where to go. I might take a look over toward the valley. The one they call Kangaroo." The last 2 words were mumbled with a full mouth. He had to gulp to clear it. Miss Jones looked away. "He'll choke," she thought, "or die of indigestion. He never seems to chew anything." Trying to remember what she had heard about the valley, she nodded. Yes, it's a long way to walk, though. She had thought of the boy tramping mile after mile and the sun flaring down. By midday the heat would be excessive. The boy buttered bread. "I don't know," he said. "They tell me it ain't all that far. Maybe 5 to 6 or 7 miles as the crow flies. That is," he added. Miss Jones nodded again. "You're not a crow," she said with a smile, "so I expect it will take you longer. It seems a long way for a walk just the same." She noticed for the first time that his hair was wet, his shoulders too. "My," she went on, "you look soaked. Aren't you chilly at this hour in the morning?" Though it was warm, she shivered. The light looked gray outside the window. Absently the boy rubbed his head. "Yeah," he agreed, "but when the sun gets up, I'll dry in seconds. You can tell by the sky it'll be another scorcher." For the rest of the meal he ate in silence. Miss Jones prepared the men's breakfast. One of the aboriginal maids came in for cutlery. The boy watched her movements. Her slim black hands seemed to flutter over the sideboard. Watching her go out, after talking with Miss Jones, he pushed away his plate. "I'll bet she can walk," he said as he left the table. "I was watching her then. You can tell by the way she moves." On his way to the door, he picked up the sandwiches. Miss Jones smiled. "Yes," she told him. "I'll bet she can. Now have a good day and enjoy yourself. We'll see you tonight about mealtime." Bending over, she dropped a row of steaks into a large pan. The fat hissed and crackled. Outside, the boy hefted the sandwiches. "I don't know," he thought, "but there's a fair old whack. We sure ain't going to go hungry." Walking quickly, he hurried along the hedge and pushed open the gate. "Come on, mate," he said to Rags. "We're on our way. We'll nip out past the trough and get crackin'. There's a lot of bush out there to see." Walking slowly, the boy glanced about him. To the west he could see the great sea of sand, bridging away in wind-rippled sandhills. They looked crimson and shadowy, reflecting the sky. "Another hour," he thought, "and they'll be brilliant yellow. Then later on you'll see 'em change to hazy, shimmering dust color. Ah, the pictures'll come, dancing jiggery-doo on the skyline." For a while he wondered about mirages, what caused them, and how you come to see trees and water when they just ain't there. Thinking about this, he noticed a big brown eagle floating gradually toward him. He thought it was one he had seen with Ted and Yabba. As it floated near, then circled overhead, he could see its steely claws tucked in against its tail, but the cruel-beaked head seemed to be following his every movement. "I don't like it," he told Rags. "You get a bird like that, he could do a lot of damage. The way he's looking, he's got his eyes on the pair of us." Suddenly the bird rose with one great sweep of its wings, then keeled downwards. The boy gasped at it as it hurtled past before soaring high again. Hovering once more, it hung poised against the sky, outlined by the orange-red rising sun. The bird's great breast and wings glowed bronze in the blaze of light. The boy scratched his head. "You know," he whispered down to Rags, "I think I know what's wrong. He's got a nest somewhere, and it's his way of warning. Keep away, or I'll come down, straight at you." After a few more minutes, the boy's words proved to be right. The eagle floated around in ever-widening circles and slowly drifted away. The boy saw it hover, hanging sentinel over a sandhill. He guessed its nest was somewhere beyond. Not sure of his direction, he plodded on. Mile after mile of dusty scrub and plain passed slowly. The sun flared heat, angling gradually higher. At times he caught glimpses of cattle or horses grazing, but for the most part the vast distances seemed to be empty. He wondered where all the stock could be. "You don't see 'em," he thought, "yet there's thousands on Yambura, and as for kangaroos, I ain't even seen a trace." Then, close to a mulga scrub clump, he trod carefully after telling Rags to be quiet. Printed deep in the dust were the tracks of a big old man kangaroo. The twin narrow paw marks were spaced behind by a long indented tail mark. Between each set of tracks the boy paced almost 30 feet. "Phew," he thought, "he sure was hopping. Something must have frightened him." Searching on, he hoped to see the kangaroo, though the scrub changed from spindly mulga to denser, more tangled scrub. The path he was following became almost impassable. When he finally pushed clear to a scrub-dotted plain, he strode freely again. He turned his head to speak to Rags, then suddenly stopped. Rags bumped against his heels. Within yards of them both stalked a lean, grim aboriginal. His ochre-daubed face peered out under shaggy hair. A cluster of spears leaned balanced on his arm. Stunned for a moment, the boy stared. Rags crept forward to bristle between the boy and the aboriginal. All three kept silent until suddenly the boy said, "Cor, where did you come from? I never heard a whisper." The aboriginal grunted and shrugged, dust-covered, sinewy shoulders. His beetling brows creased down over the paint. "Me see 'em tracks," he mumbled gutturally. "Smell I'm you too." He flared his broad, flattened nostrils. Rags snarled savagely, worried by the voice. The boy clutched his neck. Crouched together on the ground, they stared up at the fierce-looking tribesman. The man's eyes stared stonily, unblinking in their crevices. A dirty woven cloth clung bound around his loins. For the rest he was naked, lean as a muscled Brumby horse. Every muscle rippled when he jabbed a finger downwards, pointing near his feet. "Big one, kangaroo. He passed by, hour before you." The boy screwed his own face in puzzled concentration. "I dunno," he thought, "who he can be. But I think I've heard that voice. The trouble is I can't place it." Nodding cautiously, he said, "Yeah, but how do you know? It could have been yesterday or some other time." The stony eyes flickered, staring beyond the boy. The aboriginal grunted. "Suppose me tell 'em you no savvy." And he sniffled thoughtfully. Still puzzled, the boy held Rags between his legs while he straightened. "No," he said, "I don't suppose I would, though I tell you," he added, "I spotted the tracks all right. In a way, it's what we came out to see. Kangaroos, I mean. As he finished, the aboriginal spat, then scratched his foot with a spear. A flight of cockatoos flew screeching overhead. The aboriginal grunted before he gathered his spears. "Come," he told the boy, "I show you kangaroo. Big fella one, and Mary got 'em pickanin along belly." Tapping his own hard stomach, he turned away. The keen, sharp spear blades glinted in the sunlight. Undecided, the boy followed slowly. "I suppose he means pouch," he thought. "Does with their little joeys. But the thing is, who is he? There's a few of 'em about, and he must be a wild one. Yet he seems a decent feller." Walking faster, he caught up with the aboriginal and strode just behind him. Rags followed the boy, staying close to his heels. In single file, they angled across the plain. When the scrub clustered thickly again, the aboriginal swayed and twisted. Twigs, leaves, and branches slid over his shoulders without even rustling. His feet glided ghost-like on the cracked, dusty ground. Trying to follow suit, the boy heard his own boots scuff and felt his shirt catch on the branches. The sandwiches hindered him when he had to use his hands. Trotting behind, Rags pricked his ears and wondered. Near a scrub-rimmed ridge, the aboriginal raised his hand. The black fingers fluttered, imitating a bird. Fierce-eyed, he motioned the boy to get down and crawl on his hands and knees and keep Rags with him. The boy nodded in answer before he crouched down. He guessed that a valley lay just beyond the ridge. On all fours in the dust, he followed the scared, calloused heels in front. The scarred, calloused heels. The aboriginal moved in a rigid-limbed way that seemed without motion. His feet shuffled, though the long, lean legs above neither twitched nor bent. Close to the ridge crest, he stopped. The boy heard him spit, then say, "Don't move, I'm head quickly. Suppose you look, you see plenty kangaroo." Inch by inch, the boy raised his head through the gap between the aboriginal's legs. He peered down into a valley. At first he could see only a great brown sea of grass, stretching into the distance. Then he saw the kangaroos, hundreds of them, lengthened out on the grass as they fed. He gaped in astonishment. "Corey," muttered at last, "just look at 'em. You can't see 'em at first for the glare." Gradually sitting up, he dusted his hands. Rags sprawled behind, close to his back for shade. For an hour the boy sat, absorbed in the feeding animals. When they looked up, their prick-eared heads puzzled at the grim-faced aboriginal. Standing motionless, he seemed carved in daubed black stone, part of the great silent country. The boy sat hidden behind a shrub. Finally, hissing first between his teeth, the aboriginal grunted, "Me kill 'em one, then we go." The boy felt sorry. He liked it there, watching the quiet, peaceful animals. They looked contented, nuzzling around in the grass. Some had young ones hopping in and out of their pouches. He could see one big, old man scratching under its armpits. Another lay on its back to roll and kick. The long, tapering tail flicked backward and forward. Crawling away from the rim until he was out of their sight, he whispered, "Ah, don't you have to do it? They're right like they are down there." As he whispered, Rags stretched stiffly. He was unused to the still, quiet watchfulness. Easing backwards with the same rigid-limbed action, the aboriginal turned when he was hidden from the kangaroos. Under the beetling brows, his stony eyes flickered downwards before he pointed with a spear. His long black arm glistened in the sunlight. "That way," he grunted. "Suppose you walk straight. You find Yambura, me spear kangaroo when you're gone." He slid the spear back through his hand, then thudded the butt on the ground. The boy remembered the sandwiches. Glancing upward, he could see the sun would soon be overhead. "It's getting on," he thought, "and about time for some tucker." If I offer him some, he might change his mind. There's a fair-sized pile of 'em here." He hefted the package as he said, "You could have a sandwich if you like. Maybe they ain't what you're used to, but they're good just the same." To show what he meant, he slapped the package between his two hands. With the spear butt gripped in his toes, the Aboriginal scratched a circle, then stood his foot in the center. "More better you eat 'em," he grunted. "White lubra make 'em for you. My belly hard." He rested the spear on his chest to rub his ridged, corded stomach. Starting to scramble up, the boy said, "Okay then, if that's how you want it, but watch where you're spearin'. Some of 'em got young'uns, and it wouldn't be right." Feeling there was nothing more to say, he hitched his trousers and clicked his fingers to Rags. The two began walking behind them with his foot still in the circle. The Aboriginal leaned on his spears. After a few paces, the boy turned to add, "Thanks anyway for showing us the ruse. I'm glad we run into you." Then he continued on, with Rags padding close to his heels. At the bottom of the ridge, they both swung around in surprise. The boy had to grip Rags to stop him hurtling forward. Almost within touch of them, the Aboriginal strode soundlessly. "Phew," the boy said, "you don't make much noise. Even Rags here didn't hear you. We just sort of sensed you." The Aboriginal spat, then wiped his mouth on a spear handle. Side by side with the boy, he blew out his lips as they walked along again. Under a drought-twisted mulga, he stared about swiftly before he grunted, "Me eat 'em sandwich along you two fellas. This place I'm good all right." Bending over, he scraped a patch of ground clear and pointed to the center. "You sit there," he added. "Me here, and dog fella, he sit beside you." And resting the spears on his lap, he squatted down abruptly. A splash of shade from the mulga dappled his lean, dusty shape. The boy knelt while he unwrapped the sandwiches. Rags sprawled nearby on the scraped, bare ground. "You know," the boy said, "I'm glad you didn't spear a kangaroo. We sorta got to know 'em sittin' up there on that ridge." To be fair, he counted the sandwiches. There were 5, counting the thick one put in for Rags. He fed Rags first, then passed 2 sandwiches to the Aboriginal. The 2 for himself he rested on the paper. "There you are," he added. "That's share and share alike. Now all you have to do is eat 'em." Lifting one of his own, he took a mouth-filling bite and watched Rags bolt his own special portion. The Aboriginal sniffed before he nibbled, a first testing taste. As he swallowed, a smile cracked his beetle-daubed face. "Ah," he grunted. "I'm he good too much. No taste, all the same kangaroo." And like the boy, he crunched off a great mouthful. Hungrily chewing, they stared at each other's faces in silence. Finally the boy wiped his mouth. "Well, there it is," he nodded, "and they're all gone. I don't know about you, but I better be on my way. There's a fair old step between here and Yambura." Leaning over before he stood up, he stuffed the paper under a tree root. In one silent movement, the Aboriginal rose, then touched the boy's arm. "Me go too," he said softly. "Got 'em far away walk before sun altogether die." With the spears held slantingly across his shoulder, he strode swiftly away. Without another glance, his broad, calloused feet glided quietly on the dust. The boy stared after him for a moment and noticed how the tall, lean figure merged into the brown bush distances. In the hot noonday sun, every leaf of scrub drooped quiet and still. Yet the Aboriginal made no disruptive movements. He's part of it, the boy thought, and though he's moving, you don't seem to notice. Feeling left alone, he suddenly called, "So long, and all the best. I'll maybe see you again." He felt pleased when the Aboriginal paused and twirled a spear. A fleeting glint of sunlight reflected on the blade. Trudging the lonely miles, the boy thought about the morning. He remembered sitting on the ridge and watching the kangaroos. There ain't many, he told Rags, that get a chance like that. And thinking it over more as the slow miles passed, he added, The more you think about it, the better it was. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Our luck was really in. When they reached the trough, evening darkened the surroundings. Raw crimson sky flared redly beyond the sandhills. Shadows blurred the hollows into deep smudged pools. In the kitchen, Miss Jones had lit the big bowled table lamp. From the men's quarters and homestead came the sparkle of electric lights. He could hear the motor humming. It's homely, he thought, and feels sure and safe. You notice it more after being away all day. Walking on past the trough, he shut Rags in the shed before swinging again towards the kitchen. He felt glad when he reached the door. His legs were aching as he pushed it open. Inside smelled warm, with the tang of fresh-made tea. Miss Jones had a pot in her hand. "I heard the gate," she said, "and guessed it was you. Did you have a really nice day?" The boy told her he had as he sat down at the table in the soft golden light of the lamp. The kitchen seemed cozy after the great brown loneliness outside. He felt drowsy and almost too tired to eat or talk, but he nodded and said, "Thanks, Miss Jones," when she set a meal in front of him. He was glad she worked afterwards without talking. Sitting hunched over the table while he ate, he remembered the aboriginal and wondered where he was, wondered, too, whether he had gone back to spear a kangaroo. You never know, he thought. He might not have done, but he'd have to do sometime. Everyone kills to eat, and he gulped a big mouthful of tea. Miss Jones looked around from the sink when she heard his half-choked sigh.